Hey everyone, and welcome to Hello Interviews. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Christian, my good friend. Christian's an EM at Meta currently, and he's supporting a team around AI infra. Christian's also a race car driver, a bread maker, and a fountain of bravette. So super excited to have him on the channel today. Christian, it's great to have you on tonight.
It's good to be here. It's been a while since we've chatted.
It has. Yeah. Well, I've got a bunch of questions for you that I hope will resonate with our audience. So I'll dive right in. I guess to get started and so people can get to know you a little bit, how did you get to Meta?
I always look at people who get a degree in arts and then end up project managers and then they go do something else with hardware and stuff with like admiration because I don't know how they get there. For me, it's pretty simple. Computer science degree, computer engineering, software engineering, and then eventually very slowly got to Meta. I spent a very long time before Meta on a few teams at Microsoft. I guess, yeah, the long answer is I spent a long amount of time on a team where I was doing a lot of fun stuff, was doing something that's kind of a personal passion, and it was great fun, working with great people, but then eventually hit kind of a ceiling there. And then I tried a couple other teams and nothing really clicked. And then I was like, okay, I guess I got to start looking elsewhere. And Meta was expanding in our Seattle area. So yeah, it was a little bit late, but better late than never.
Super interesting. And you've had a long career. So you mentioned
It's
this
a very nice
long.
way of saying you're old.
Generally speaking, we talk with a lot of people who have moved between jobs really quickly. I don't know whether this is like a zero interest phenomenon or this is actually just the tech industry at large. But for you, it seems to have not been the case. What's your take on this, especially as a hiring manager? Is job hopping dead, or are people going to continue moving between companies to try to get promotions and raises? Is there value to that anymore?
There, there is. I definitely have peers and people that I know that maybe not every 2 years, but every 2 to 3 years would move on to something new. It's generally healthy, I guess, to an extent. Like I don't think there are any extremes that are really good. So every year, team switch or even company switch, even worse, is probably not great. You're probably not learning as much as you can from the environment. It takes you forever to even just get up to speed with everybody else around you. So for you to learn something that's substantial, probably would take more than a year for most people. At the other end of the spectrum, like I definitely spent more time than I should have on some teams that I've been on just because I let inertia kind of take over. Jobs have high switching costs, right? So it's always easier just to stay where you are. And for a lot of people, if there isn't a whole lot of pain with the current job, or if they're not sacrificing too much of whatever it is they're looking for, they tend to just kind of stay. You speak to a lot of people that say, oh, I should really leave this job. I'm not happy here. But then they just don't really do anything about it, which is not irrational. We all just have a threshold of pain beyond which we get motivated to start, putting in the effort.
Yeah, you kind of zoomed in
Anyway,
on that moment where you feel like a person ought to switch teams or switch companies.
I feel like there's different thresholds for different people, obviously, but there's also different thresholds for where you are in life, and whether you've done it before or not. Like it's one of those things, just like everything, it gets better. Like switching jobs, actually, you have to go through interview loops and stuff, and with more practice, that whole thing becomes easier.
Hmm.
So, like maybe your first job switch is probably the hardest, and then the second was a little bit easier, and then the third one is a little bit easier. I definitely observed this with my own career on teams. Like I don't switch companies very often, but I switch teams inside. And the second team switch was definitely easier than the first team switch. And the third is a lot easier because you're not really as worried about it. You've kind of proved to yourself that you can thrive in different environments. You don't have that, sick to your stomach kind of worry about how's it going to be? Am I going to like it? You learn a little bit more about what you like and what you don't like, and you kind of keep fine tuning and optimizing. So it definitely is one of those things that get better with practice.
This is a slight pivot, but it's connected in at least in my mind. For a lot of our audience, they're junior engineers. They might be just getting into the industry. And I think everyone's confidence at this stage in tech is kind of shaken. It's like, are we undergoing a revolution, kind of like the Luddites observed, where software engineering is irrelevant and we're all going to be out of a job shortly? I'd love to understand from your perspective how you see the role of SWE kind of changing in big companies. And what's your outlook, especially for, the new grad population who's really struggling in the job market right now?
Those are super interesting topics, and I'm also kind of guessing as much as anybody here, but I have some thoughts. I don't think AI is changing the what makes it a software engineer much. I think it's taken away some of the monotony, right? Like nobody enjoyed spending 20 minutes searching on Stack Overflow for how to do this dumb thing in this weird OS, right? And now we get the answer a little bit quicker. Okay, great.
Sure.
I don't think that you can take, average person off the street and give them ChatGPT and have them become even a halfway productive software engineer.
Mm,
A lot of these are like it's kind of like you have to know what to look for. You have to know how to ask questions to get the right answer, right? And you
for
have to
sure.
know when you get the wrong answer so that you can fix it. So it's a, I think all of this stuff is like it's a useful tool. If it is going to replace software engineers, I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes. Maybe 200 years. I don't know what's going to happen in 200 years, but in a range of 10 to 20, I don't think it changes anything other than just makes us all a little bit more productive. Less time chasing stupid bugs. I think it does take away this. If you look at the dimensions in which engineers are competitive or not competitive, it takes away kind of pure coding ability maybe a little bit out of the equation. It
Okay.
takes away this notion that you can just crank out a lot of lines of code and that's how you succeed as a software engineer. That was never really true to begin with. I think it becomes even less true because ChatGPT can outcode you in terms of
Mm,
pure output. But on the other side, like, okay, what becomes the important part now? And the important
yeah, what
parts
are the
now
differentiators?
I mean, it's this notion of understanding the problem and what set of solutions to deploy to a problem and what set of technologies to use for it and how to build the right abstractions for things. Software engineering and any kind of engineering is just navigating a series of trade-offs. It's always been the thing that differentiates in my mind the more senior engineers than the junior engineers is one thing is the ability to navigate the millions of trade-offs as you go. And I
Mm,
don't know that ChatGPT can do this. Like you have to really like it kind of follows what you tell it. Like if you tell it to implement something a certain way, it'll just do it. Um, in terms of weighing trade-offs and understanding user intent and understanding your if you're building a product, who the user for your product is, or what's most important for this piece of infra,
yeah.
that's still going to be more substantial than just coding it out. And then you're going to get some help in coding it out. I think it's kind of crazy for anyone to be in this business to be if you ever worked with a PM, right? Like you've spent hours and hours in meetings and documents and reviewing documents, just talking about what the requirements are and what it is that we should build. And when you're navigating those conversations, you're taking into account a whole complex matrix of what's desired, what's ideal, what's possible. And
Yeah.
you're coming up with something that kind of satisfies all these constraints. I don't think that AI can do this right now. So I think the skills are that software engineers are not dispensable. They are going to be just even more productive. And in the short term, when you become more productive, you tend to actually be even better compensated, right? If
Sure.
a company with 100 software engineers can make even more revenue because they're a lot more productive, it usually will follow that they can be paid more. So in the
Mm,
short term, I think it's actually going to be earning like it makes it a little bit more lucrative, I think.
that would be
If you
great.
can
I
use the
like
tools.
that.
Nobody cares how the code came about. Obviously, don't, follow your company policy and don't put your company's code in other people's servers and all that good stuff. But
Sure.
if you have tools, use them, right? You don't get extra reward for writing, artisan handcrafted code versus chat GPT code. Nobody's
It's
gonna pay more for
kind
that.
of unfortunate because I really do enjoy the artisanal handcrafted code. How
Have
many people have
you
written that awesome Flask code that's like so pure and so performant?
Have you
It's
ever seen the C++ obfuscation competitions where you
yes,
get
beautiful.
yeah, that's handcrafted code and it's garbage. You can't really use it. It's just fun.
I do like the fun. I hope AI doesn't take all the fun out of coding. There was this recent post, I think it was, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Steve Yeji. He used to be at Amazon. He had this very famous blog post a long time ago. And he was kind of contemplating what AI meant. And he had a lot of thoughts, and I didn't digest them all, to be honest. But one thing that he said really stuck with me, and he said, AI is going to make it uniquely difficult to be a junior software engineer. Because I think as you and I were kind of growing up as software engineers, we did the drudgery on behalf of the senior engineers who needed to, work at a higher level. And there
Yeah.
was this nice relationship where we would take on drudgery and it's like an apprenticeship and learn along the way, and they would get to execute at a higher level. if AI is doing that middle ground, it gives less of this runway for people to learn these core concepts. It's always been the case that it's difficult to teach some of the most important skills in software, learning about estimation, how to deal with failures, what architectures not to use. I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like, have you had any reflections on how you learn to design good systems and become a good engineer? And then I'm kind of curious, like, has any of that changed? Do you feel like you would offer your own self some different advice if you were in the middle of your career versus where you are now?
That's a really good question. I think to the point of being a junior engineer is more difficult. I don't know. It feels I see the point. I see the angle to this that someone could look at and say, well, as a junior software engineer, all you did was crank out code and now ChatGPT is better than you, so what's the point? But I also think that this is a very similar argument. I'm old enough to have learned, what was it? Pascal and then like C++ and then
You
the
read a lot
era
of
of
production
the
Pascal, Lele?
I no, I did
No
production
way.
C, did production Pascal, but I studied in college and then C++, and then we saw the C sharp wave and Java coming in, and it was a very similar line of reasoning used. It's like, oh, if you don't learn, how to manage your own memory by your hand, and if you just
Mm,
go straight into C sharp or Java, you're never going to be a good software engineer. Like you're never
that's a
going to
good
learn
point.
anything. You didn't go through the drudgery of manual memory management, and it
Yeah,
obviously turned out to be not true,
that's a good point.
unfortunately. Definitely
Yeah, we
teaches
probably
you a
have a
little bit
lot of
extra depth.
apps that are, multi gigabytes today. Yeah.
Yes. So I think to me feels like a similar argument that if you don't go through the manual labor and drudgery of writing things one character at a time, and you copy paste a bunch of stuff, maybe you're not learning as much. There's some element to it. Like you definitely see extremes of people who get introduced to programming via Python and then just like get completely flummoxed by the notion of sorting anything because like sort is you just call sort. Like you don't what do you mean? It's to
Right.
them it's a primitive function. But I don't think it actually in the long term hinders anything. I think a lot of the drudgery was not necessary, and the little of it that taught you something can probably be substituted for with something else. When you get to that really deep problem, or if you copy pasted a bunch of code and found a bug in it and had to spend 6 hours debugging it, you're probably going to learn the same amount as you would have done just writing it from scratch. So
Yeah.
I don't buy that one.
I
I
wanted to zoom in there. The garbage collection manual memory management example is a good one where we devised a new abstraction and it's kind of unnecessary. You don't really have to think about it anymore, which is super convenient. But I think one that a lot of people are struggling with, at least in our audience, is like system design. They will learn how to design systems. And when I reflect back on how I learned how to design systems, I think most of it I cut my teeth at Expedia and Amazon, mostly just deploying garbage ideas into production and having to deal with the failures for many months and sitting on call. And I do wonder how often people are going to get an opportunity to do that. I maybe the more concrete question for you, and we'll zoom in a little bit on system design because I think it's interesting. How do you learn that stuff that seems like you need a lot of experience? Like a lot of people, for instance, who interview at Meta, for the very first time, they're having a system design interview. And for some of them, they say, I've never dealt with a web scale system before. How could I possibly pass this interview? Can you learn this stuff? Do you think it's learnable?
It's learnable. I think the problem, and this applies to all kind of learning, is it turns out that like struggle is a necessary part of learning, or at least it accelerates and allows you to be able to easier recall what you've learned when you struggle
Sure.
through it. This has been
Sure.
studied. I was actually reading a book about learning, which is kind of fascinating, but like struggling to remember something helps you remember it better next time. It's kind of
Okay.
true of all learning. I think some element of this is the main thing about system design is that, you'll never forget that time that you built something in a really dumb way and it blew up in your face when it went to production and you stayed up all night or whatever it was and you got embarrassed in front
Sure.
of your peers to fix it. You can't substitute for that. This is just kind of like you only need to do this once and you learn so much from it.
Hmm.
You can augment it though. Like the thing about learning is like there's a bunch of different ways and they have different, I don't know if you can call it throughput. like, but definitely absorption rates, right? Like you learn from actual experience, that's a super high absorption rate.
Okay.
You learn so much. You read a book or a blog, you learn a little bit less per unit time spent, but you're still learning something. It's not zero. You don't absorb nothing of it. And I think what would help is, as you're reading about system design, for me, it tells me to read. Like I tried reading the books. The books never really taught me much because they tend to be kind of almost contextless, or at least there's not enough context for me.
Dynamic. Yeah.
I like reading about the struggles. A lot of the
Mm,
engineering blogs are really good at that, where they kind of go over like, here's was our problem, and here's how it blew up in our face, and then here's how we
get
fixed
that.
it, and then this was the downside of that. So they walk you through that kind of the journey, and you feel a little bit of the pain that they felt, and that helps it stick a little bit better to me.
That's
Even
actually
better
really
if you do.
interesting.
What's
Yeah,
that?
because I think there's a connection here to like typical human storytelling, right? You
Yeah.
need a protagonist and you need a struggle or some conflict. And a lot of things for many people don't stick until they can hear the story. And I think those are really useful memory devices and they help you to integrate into your mental model. So I love the idea of specifically looking for those postmortems of people's mistakes.
Yeah, that struggle turns out to be necessary, and the story helps it stick. You can probably extract more out of it if again, from that book that I was reading about learning, quizzes are good. Like, I think this is
Mm,
part of why you retain so little. I watch a lot of YouTube videos that are kind of educational. Like, I don't know if you've watched Three Blue, One Brown.
yeah. Edutainment, they describe it as.
Amazing stuff, really, really amazing stuff, super deep, and connections that, like, I really love how he lays bare some connections that I never thought existed,
Yeah,
and the visualization of certain math problems. But I can't remember, I can't name three videos that I watched, even
sure.
though I watched like 30. The ones that stick with me are the ones that, like, something that I used later or recalled later or something like that. So adding a quiz element, or adding some element where you take something that you read about or you watched a video about, and then you try it, or doing like I think this is where mock interviews are really awesome, because they give you that quiz. And it turns out that, again, like, just having a quiz, just having being tested on some body of knowledge actually helps you retain it longer.
We didn't
That's
pay
kind
him
of
to say
scientifically
that. So
proven.
we have someone that just mentioned that the three brown, one blue. They made the same comment that they watch a lot of videos and content for what it's worth, and they fail to retain. And I think what they had done is they actually go ask ChatGPT to create a quiz afterward. So that way they can, start to integrate that knowledge. And I thought, wow, you have a lot more energy than I oftentimes
That
for.
That's very smart. Yeah, I'll send you a recommendation to that book later, because that was kind of a mind opener on how we learn, and why, you can read a lot of books and not gather a lot out of them, and then you can read this one thing that kind of sticks with you. Yeah, it's just how humans learn. Like, we're almost wired to filter out a lot of stuff, and stuff that, we've put a mental marker in, or stuff that was a little bit painful in one way or another, including, being quizzed and struggling to remember. The struggle is necessary.
Yeah. No, I love it. It's super cool reflections. And I like the emphasis on learning. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit to talk about kind of the application. I think, there's a bunch of people who are currently getting jobs at big tech companies, sometimes for the first time. And the real question for them is, how can I be effective? I think I talked with a number of people and they're sitting in their seats and going, I am worried that I'm going to get pitched. They're overcome with their imposter syndrome. They've just nailed the interview, but they're not sure whether they're going to make it. And the reality is they are.
Yeah.
Some people certainly do lose their jobs, but they're far in between. But I'm curious from your perspective, you've certainly hired a number of people, you've mentored people through those early phases. What does it take to be effective in a big company, and how ought engineers to think about setting themselves up in those first 3 to 6 months?
That's a great question. I guess I totally empathize with imposter syndrome. We all felt it. We all feel it occasionally. It's normal. It's kind of healthy almost, because it gets you trying at least. So you can kind of take something good out of it. I guess, when you're settling in, right? Like, a lot of people just focus on the tech. And I've seen a bunch of people focus on learning the wrong way. I see a lot of people
What's
like,
the
oh,
wrong way?
reading. They just sit there and read
Okay,
documents all day. And again, like it's kind of like watching YouTube educational videos. It's great fun. It's good to read code. It's
sure.
necessary. You need to do some amount of that, but you're not going to retain like 20% of what you read, especially when you go down to like these deep, like, there's 20-page documents and the history of the product and this note from when we launched and this diagram about the architecture. No, very little of that's going to stick because it has nowhere to anchor itself into. I recommend, like, I usually advise people to, like, you have to learn by doing, right? You have to start doing stuff. It's fine to spend a couple of days, setting yourself up and setting your environment and doing some code reviews or just looking at code. A lot of people will review the code but not leave comments because I don't know if what I'm saying is dumb or not. So just silently review the code and then just keep the comments for yourself. I see a lot of people do that. That's totally fine. But you can't do that for 3 months. Like, you're just wasting your
Sure.
time after a certain small amount of that. After that, you really have to dig
Okay,
in,
great.
just start small, do something, ship something. I think you kind of probably had a similar strategy like from a manager point of view. Like, what I'm looking to do for someone joining the team is give them confidence, right? I know they're feeling imposter syndrome. I know they're not quite sure what's going on. Best thing for their confidence is to get them to ship something. It doesn't really matter what it is. It could be like a one character change. But you
Yeah.
go through the motions, submit your diff review, you land it, and now you're like, okay, now I've done something productive. I can do this, and then you can get bigger and bigger. So start small, get your hands dirty. I usually recommend people go a little bit deeper before they go broader, because
Mm,
again, it's just easier to go on I mean, you join any modern company these days, and you can spend the rest of your life reading documents and stuff that has been written in the last year or two. There's,
sure.
60,000 people who work here. They wrote a lot of stuff. So do stuff, go a little bit deeper before you go broad, just so you don't succumb to this notion of I'm just going to learn everything there is about this area that I'm in. And then you can, after you go a little bit deep, you can kind of back up and then you can have some context to understand the rest of the world.
Does this
Um,
change when you think about like a staff or a more senior engineer versus, someone joining for a
It
junior?
does. It does a bit. Although, I mean, you've been probably in the same place. I joined teams as manager, and like the first thing I've done is try to land a pice of code. Not
Okay.
because my job is going to have anything to do with the code, but I
Wait, were
want
you
to get a feel
successful?
in landing the code. I was mostly. I think I
Okay,
still have some abandoned bits
respect.
from nine
Yeah,
months
you
ago
really
from
lost
this.
it.
ChatGPT, man, you should try it.
Oh, that's awesome.
For a senior engineer, and I think this was the second element that I was going to speak to for every engineer really, is you kind of have to understand the environment and the culture and the expectations and how to communicate effectively.
Yeah.
I've been in two different tech companies and they were vastly different in like how can you be effective in getting something done. And the tactics that you would use in one would completely backfire in the other. And the worst thing is, especially if you have prior experience, is to come in with this preconceived notion of how I'm going to get things done and then have
Oh,
it
it's the worst.
massively blow up in your face. I have
The
a couple of
worst.
stories for really senior people that, joined a company, treated it like their last company, and then it was like you can't recover from that. If you're a senior, for sure you cannot recover from that. You said the wrong first impression with an organization of 100 people, and that's tough to
That's
come back
tough.
from.
Yeah,
Um,
you're in the limelight.
so lay low a little bit on like talk to people, understand what they care about. Drew Bosworth that has a really good article on this cold start algorithm is what he calls it when he lands in a new organization or team.
Yeah,
He talks to people and he asks them about a certain set of questions to understand what they care about, what are the top of mind worries for them, what their objectives are. So I think it's again it's definitely more important for someone senior, and it's harder for a senior person because a senior person is trying to understand the context around 30 or 50 people, whereas if you're joining the team as a junior, the number of people who's you care about is maybe 10. Your
mm,
manager, maybe your skip, a couple of your peers and a PM, and you're kind of you're off to the races. But the
sure.
same concepts apply. Understand what they care about. Observe how communication happens, and see if you can kind of just fit in. I'm usually a kind of fit in person. I'm not like a come in and try to rebuild things from scratch kind of person.
Okay.
Um, And it's usually a
Even
more
is
effective
important.
way, at least. Yeah, build trust, right?
The trust
Um,
aspect, I think, is kind of the unsung hero, especially for the more senior folks. I guess.
you have to operate on like a, there's you build up credit and then you use it. And if you're really good about it, you're always aware of whether you're, crediting your account or you're withdrawing from your account.
Right.
Um, and when you start out, you don't start with a lot. You get a certain amount of credit, different with different people. Some people will give you a lot of credit because, hey, you made it here, you passed the interviews, you must be amazing.
Right.
And some people will be very skeptical, like, I don't know if you're good enough to be here. But
I
yeah,
think that
understand the tech, understand, get productive, get your hands dirty really quickly, understand the expectations and how people communicate, and you're gonna be pretty much set. It's much easier said than done, obviously, and it does take a while. I guess the last thing is just align with your manager on what their expectations are for your ramp up,
okay.
just so you don't put yourself under undue stress. Like some people, they really like, I did this thing before and I'm gonna hit the ground running, and for a million good reasons they can't hit the ground running, and nobody's actually expecting you to hit the ground running, but now you feel bad and you really
Mm,
shouldn't, right? So
yeah.
I always tell people, like, I expect you, at this level, I expect you to take 3 months to ramp up before you become fully productive, or at higher level I expect you to take longer, and the higher level you are, the longer it'll take you, obviously.
I think that's a
um
good point. Yeah, you want to make sure your leadership team is giving you space to actually do that necessary ramp, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up for an Icarus situation where,
yeah,
it's going to come crashing down. I actually
yeah,
I love some of the things that you mentioned about getting your hands dirty. I think there's actually a nice interplay with trust and, actually getting on the ground and doing some real work. One of the things that I always loved when I was joining a new team, even as a manager, is I would jump in the on call as soon as I could. And it was like a dual thing. One was like I'd learn a lot about the system and the things that people didn't want to talk about. And then secondly, people appreciate that. Someone who's willing to come in and pull
yes.
away, especially managers. Having managers on call is always a little bit weird because some managers just don't have those technical expertise. So it's a really great way to earn trust with the people who really value the hands-on technical work.
Every engineer would salute you for voluntarily becoming part of the on-call as a manager. They're like, "What? Are you serious? Like you're
Exactly.
doing this?" Yeah,
Hack
that's
for all you
that's
managers out there. That's the key to do it. Well, on this vein of trust, I think there's kind of this interesting first impression that you end up having with your manager and your team. There's actually this dynamic that I didn't think would become popular, but it has. So at Meta, when I was there, I guess it was Facebook, they used to have this thing called boot camp, which was really weird. You kind of got hired in the company, and then you would work with a bunch of different teams and kind of get to know them a little bit, and then make the decision, and it was super cool. It's absolutely one of my most favorite memories in my time there. And I'm kind of sad that they've mostly gotten rid of this. They've moved toward this model very much like what Google does, where you'll get an offer, but you'll do that team matching kind of externally. So you'll meet with a
yeah.
bunch of hiring managers, you'll ask them questions, and then you'll make your decision. And that can be nice from some level because just joining a company and not knowing what you're going to be doing is like really kind of odd. And there was a lot of people who said, "I hell no, I'm not going to do that."
Yes.
But it is a new dynamic for people to navigate to say, all right, team match, how do I do this? You've obviously met with tons of people in this capacity. I'm wondering what advice you might have for engineers who are going through this team match right now with companies like Meta, Google, and others.
Yeah, the team match can be probably frustrating because you feel like, you go through the interviews and they're hard enough, and you wait and you get the result and you finally get like, okay, you're through, and then you wait again. So it's kind of like a hurry up and go sort of thing. It probably doesn't feel
Yeah.
great. For team match, i- it's kind of interesting because you're trying to figure out if the team is right for you, and the manager is trying to figure out if you're right for the team. And I don't know how every manager does it. This is just something that I had to make up as I go, and I do it based on
They
my
don't tell you
own.
how to do this. They'll say,
You,
here,
you
Christian.
don't get team match interview training or anything like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
For me, it's down to checking for the thing. Like I've seen a lot of people be successful, and I've seen a lot of people not be as successful, and I'm trying to assess whether the setup is going to be successful. And for me, before the interview match, before the team match interview, I've seen your resume, I've seen your previous work, I've seen your interview feedback. I know that you did really, really well in system design, and you maybe did okay on coding, but not great.
Mm,
I know all of that up front. That's all in the system there for me to read. So I go through that, and when I decided to take the team match, it's probably because I think, there's a good chance here of having something that works. And I really think of it as a two-way street. I don't really think of it as one way. It's not me deciding to hire you. I know that you are good enough to be in the company and that there are teams out there that are going to be great for you. Like one of the main things that I care about is this notion of having a good match. And for me, a good match is if I'm looking for someone who's senior, then I'm looking for someone with some ability or experience or skill set that matches what we do. This can be tech stack. Right now, I'm hiring for C++, and C++ is specialized enough that I kind of value have someone having written production C++ code before.
Okay.
It wouldn't be the same if it was like, Java to C Sharp, all of the stuff is all the same. That's fine. But C++ is a little bit peculiar enough and people have a love it or hate it thing with it. So I kind of look for that. And honestly, it doesn't even have to be like on the technical skill set side, it doesn't have to be an exact match. Like there's no way you would have done exactly the same thing we're doing with the exact same tech stack that we're doing, but having some overlap is nice. And when there isn't that overlap or when there's something that's very specific that you don't know, then I'm looking for examples from the past where you learned something kind of quickly, right? So I want to know that, you've landed before on a team and you didn't know the language and you picked it up real quick and you ran with
How
it.
do you
And
learn that? Like, what kind of things are you asking in order to figure out whether people have
that's
done
for
this?
stories, and then you check for I mean, it's kind of the same as the behavioral interview, right? Like, how do you, people can say anything. How do you know what they're saying is actually real?
Right.
You look for a story, and the more detail and the more vivid the story is, then, the more believable it sounds, right? Like, it's very easy for me to say, oh, yeah, I learned everything super fast. It's a little bit harder for me to say, well, there's this one time when I joined a team and I didn't know any C++, and, within 6 months, I was super productive. That's still reasonably easy to say. And then the more detail I add to the story, right, the more you know it's true. So there's an element of storytelling there. I want to hear a good story. But for most people, it really doesn't even boil down to the technical skill set because, again, I could gather a lot of this from your resume. Like I know from your resume whether you've been working with C++ or something else or with Kotlin or whatever it is. So it comes down to I want to know that you're interested in the kind of work that we do. This is more for the senior engineers. Like junior engineers, the trick. It's like they're kind of, everybody's writing code for the most part and a little bit of design. Like, the job. The job is pretty standard at the junior level. And then the senior level, it's completely different. Like one senior engineer could be doing nothing but writing code and one senior engineer could be doing zero code. And there's anything in between. Same with tech leads, same with managers. So as you go up, like the difference in profile can be big. So when I'm hiring a senior engineer, I'm looking to see that, what you would like to spend your time doing is what I need you to be doing, right? And for me, that translates like, hey, I need someone who's going to be spending half of the time writing code. Like, yes, you're a senior engineer. Yes, you're going to be designing stuff. Yes, you're going to be mentoring. Yes, you're going to be making big decisions. But I also want you to be hands-on. The team needs you to be hands-on and writing code. This is very easy to check for. Like, how do you spend your time? How would you like to spend your time? And if you just want to be an architect, some companies have that role where you're an architect, you're designing stuff, you're not writing any code. Then that's great. I just don't have that for you. If you want to be writing tons of code and doing nothing else and just not interacting with human beings at all, then maybe this also isn't for you. So I look for the match in terms of what you like to spend your time doing and what the team needs you to be doing. And then I look for a match on the motivation side. Why here? Why this team? It sounds a little bit cheesy, but I'm really looking for something that tells me that you're going to be fired up about this job, right? Because I think and this is not just for my benefit. This is not just selfish. Like you want to be happy in your job. I want you to be happy in your job because when you're happy in your job, you're the most productive. And I've been again in those situations where I wasn't happy, it didn't match what I wanted, and I wasn't productive. So I'm looking for like what fires you up, what gets you out of bed in the morning, and trying to understand if I have a match for that or not. And this is the place where there's just a huge amount of variance between people. Some people get super excited about the problem space. Some people are super mission driven. Like they just want to be doing something that they view as super valuable or fun or good for the world. Some people are purely motivated by the tools they're going to be using or the language. Like I've met people and I have friends like that that like they'll do anything so long as it's in C++. Like that doesn't matter what it is. Like nuclear
Sure.
bomb, fine. Medical innovation, totally fine. Anything, so long as it's C++.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for what the person's passion is and what they're trying to get out of it, and trying to make sure that I have a good match for that.
That's actually
And the
kind of
thing,
nice because there seems like there's this symmetry that, generally speaking, in from the candidate side, they're really trying to figure out whether your team is a good fit for them. If you're saying, hey, a lot of the things that I'm evaluating as a hiring manager are really, is it going to be a good fit for you? Then there's not necessarily much misalignment here. People don't have to overthink this process.
I think that's the nice part. Yeah, there isn't, and I try to get like I try to get beyond the surface answers, right? Like the
Mm,
stuff that's not helpful in this, and I hear it a lot of like, "What are you looking for?" I'm looking for growth. Well, aren't we all? Like, of course you're looking for growth. Right? Like, I've never heard someone tell me like, "I'm just looking to stagnate here." Like that doesn't happen.
I
Uh,
have. I've had a few interviews like that.
I'm
I'm
just
to work
joining the
with.
country club.
Very honest.
So I'm looking to get to the real meat of it, and I advise people like, okay, this is not actually what you're looking for, and this is what you're looking for instead. And similar for people who just want to spend their time, doing more design than and review than coding. It's like, you know what? That's not gonna work here. You're not gonna be successful. You're not gonna be happy about it. We're not gonna be happy about it. So yeah, I try to position it as it's a win-win, right? If we have a great match here, then we both should feel like we're winning. And if either one of us, if I can get you fired up on the team and you can't get excited about the team, then it just isn't going to work. And it's a little bit tough because some of the people have been in team match for a long time. And if you've been in this process for, I don't know how many people you meet in a month or two, then it feels like, okay, I just need to settle into anything. I'll figure it out later. And I think
Mm,
that's probably a bad idea to just settle. Maybe it's necessary in some cases, but in most cases, you don't have to settle. There's just a lot of stuff out there, and it just takes a while to get through all the possible teams, and it's harder from the outside. I think that was the beauty of boot camp. You got full access to all, internal information, right?
yeah.
Whereas from the
Yeah.
outside, you don't get to see what we're writing. You don't get to see us on Workplace. You don't get to see the chats, the code. So it's a little bit harder. But it's probably worth holding out for something that you really feel fired up about. In most cases, some cases you really just need to get the hell out of wherever it is you are. That's fine.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely encouraging to hear that the hiring managers are really kind of looking out for your best interest. It sounds like, somebody takes a meeting with you, they're at least going to learn a bit more about what it is that they actually wanted and maybe even get some good pointers if it's not the right fit. So, those meetings
Yeah,
they can be
I would say
productive.
don't be afraid to be a little bit opinionated. Although I would caution there was at least one example of someone that was too opinionated. Most people are on the side of just being very, they don't want to really, show their hand because they don't want to say anything that would upset anybody. And I
Okay.
understand that you end up on the extreme of being, fairly generic and I can't really get a read on what it is that you're trying to do here. On the other hand, you don't want to have a list of demands, right? Like here's my 10
Oh,
demands. Which
yeah.
I think I had one meeting that was a little bit strange where literally I was like, okay, number one, blah blah blah. Number two, number three, like I literally got like a numbered list of the demands from the
Yeah.
candidate. And that was a little bit too opinionated, maybe. Somewhere
Just
in the middle is where you want to end up.
for folks who maybe aren't seeing why, the hiring manager ends up needing to work with you. And if you're coming in and your first thing is to make a bunch of demands, they may not want to actually do that. So you definitely do want to be a bit judicious about how you approach the situation.
Anytime you're communicating, preferences or opinions or something like that, you don't want to come off too strong. Here are the things that are important to me. Here's what I care about. That's totally fine. But like, it's not like I demand I demand that you should have an easy on call and you should have, X, Y, and Z ready for me. Like, okay. Maybe.
Super transparent. I appreciate that, Christian. Well, we're at about 45 minutes. I know I had told you that I wasn't going to take up too much of your time. I've got one last question for you, and I hate to be this guy, but we are Hello Interview. So I'd love to get any advice that you might have for folks interviewing at Meta right now. What should they be on the lookout for? Do you have any tips? Obviously, don't share anything super confidential.
No, nothing. This is all random opinions. I will say a couple of things that maybe are lesser known, and maybe one thing from my own interview experience. I still remember my meta loop, even though it's been a number of years now. Um, One is do your best to ace all the interviews. It can be. I used to think that it was, it's a pass or fail. Like there's no degrees to it. It's binary. If you just get past the threshold, you're good enough. And the reality is that, the feedback they get from interviews has a lot more color to it than that. And there is such a thing as, knocking it out of the park, and there's, barely passing, and there's maybe passing with low confidence. Ask people to kind of literally put that in their feedback. So do your best to do what you can to do the best you can. And every interview is new, every interviewer is different, and every interviewer is a clean slate. So enter every interview that, intent on acing it and doing the best that you can. Don't just try to, I'll just barely pass, because it does make a difference. It does make a difference later in team match. It does make a difference in whether, the chances of getting an offer. Everything is a probability. So maximize your probabilities, do the best you can on every single interview. And I think the other one, from my own experience, like sometimes interviews go wrong for no reason, for no fault of your own.
Definitely.
Someone
Yeah.
wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, and you remind them of someone that they just had a fight with last week, and that's it. The interview is done. Like we're people, like we're trying to be as objective as we can. Everybody is. But people make mistakes. People get off on the wrong foot. It's in interviews nowadays, it's like 45 minutes, and a lot of them are remote. I would say that, like, if you feel like something happened during that interview that made it start off on the wrong foot, or there was just a miscommunication barrier that you couldn't get through to the interviewer somehow, or every time you spoke, they couldn't hear you very well, tell your recruiter. I actually had that exact experience, even though it was in person. One of my interviews, it might have even been the system design, actually. I came
I
out like
wasn't your interviewer.
I came out of the interview and I was like, that was so awful. Like I didn't really understand what he was saying, and I don't think he understood a word of what I was saying. And it was just we were just talking past each other, like we just couldn't connect. I was like, okay, maybe I blew it, like, but just completely randomly, I was like, I told the recruiter, I was like, hey, the recruiter was like, hey, how did the interviews go? I was like, everything went great. Everybody was great, except this one interview where I don't know, I couldn't communicate really well. I couldn't understand what he was saying, and he didn't really quite grasp what I was saying. And I just didn't know what he was expecting me to do at any point in time. Like when I would lead the conversation, they would interrupt. And then when I would let them, lead the conversation, they were expecting me to lead the conversation. Something was just awkward about the mechanics. And then a couple of days later, it turned out, sure enough, the interviewer had the same impression that like this wasn't working.
Hmm.
And I think I don't know how I learned this, or I don't know if they told me eventually or something. They rescheduled the interview with a different interviewer, and I
Wow. Okay.
did well on that one, and that was great, and I got the offer. And I think it was later on, maybe after receiving the offer or something, they told me, that was a person doing this interview for their first time.
Okay.
And
Everyone
yeah,
has to first. Yeah.
that is very nice. So they were learning how to do the interview, and if I didn't say something, I don't know if something would have come out of it. It would have been just you didn't pass the interview. But because I said something, because I kind of explained what was going on, then I kind of got the benefit of the doubt, and I got another interview. We do repeat interviews a lot at Meta. I don't know what other companies do, but you do get a second shot sometimes. So something is weird during interview, something is not quite clicking. You had AV issues, or you were sick that day, or whatever it is. Explain, communicate, see what happens. You'd probably be surprised that once we've invested 5-6 interviews in getting someone through the door, if there's one holdout, like it's worth it to spend another interview, do a repeat, get another opinion, right? Get a second
Definitely.
opinion on that. So that happens a lot. So don't think it's not really a one-way street. Like you can, obviously, if you go through all your interviews and they all go horribly wrong, like it's gonna be a tougher sell. Like all my interviewers were awful, you guys are awful, like don't do that.
My second shot, please. I'd really love to work there.
Yeah. It's
This
not
is
me, it's you.
yeah. Recruiters generally are very candidate favorable.
They're
They're
on your side,
gonna
which
get
is
you one for you.
literally true. Someone told me this. I didn't really believe it because I'm just not that. I guess I'm cynical too cynical to believe that. I didn't believe that the recruiter was on my side, but the recruiter is actually on your side. They're trying to get you hired. I don't know how their incentives are set up, but they are set up to hire you. And so, give them information, tell them what's going on. tell them about your competitive offers, all that stuff, because they all use that as ammo to kind of fight for you. That's kind of the nice thing about the model we have. Again, I don't know if that's true of every company,
Mm,
but it's definitely true at Meta that recruiters are on your side. They are trying their best to get you hired, and all the information you can give them that can help them with that is information that they're going to use.
perfect. Well, Christian, this was super practical. We covered a lot of ground from like AI and the philosophy of learning all the way through mechanics of working at a big company and getting ramped up to interviewing. I'll have to hit you up and include the books and blog posts that you referenced down in the comments for people who are watching along. But really appreciate you coming on, Christian. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to sending you many more candidates. Hopefully, people who are working alongside you very shortly.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm still hiring, and it's been
Awesome.
great talking to you as always.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks,
All right.
Christian.